My name is Henry Winslow. I'm 81 years old, and I suppose I've become the kind of man people don't notice anymore. I live in a wooden annex behind what used to be my own house, a faded white two-story structure that my son, Douglas, and his wife, Kayla, now claim as theirs. To anyone passing by, it might look like a family compound, a multi-generational home, perhaps, where an old man lives peacefully near his children and grandchildren. That illusion makes me laugh sometimes, not out loud, but that bitter, hollow laugh that sits in the chest and never reaches the throat. The truth is, I'm an inconvenience. I'm tolerated. I'm spoken to in clipped, exasperated tones, like a child who keeps forgetting how to tie his shoes. I was a teacher for 39 years, English literature mostly, at a modest high school in Iowa. I taught Shakespeare, Baldwin, Dickinson. I still remember how alive the classroom felt when a student would suddenly connect with a piece of writing, when you saw it light something in them. I used to believe that ideas could rescue people. I suppose I still do, in a way, though these days it feels like I've been left behind by both ideas and people. After I retired, and my wife Margaret passed 2 years later, my world began to shrink. I moved slower, but not just physically. The invitations to dinners became fewer. The church friends we used to see every Sunday after service stopped checking in. And my son, Douglas, my only child, drifted from me in ways that surprised even him, I think. It began subtly. Douglas would drop by the house now and then, ask if I needed anything. At first, I was grateful for it, grateful even to see Kayla, who never liked me much and didn't try to hide it. But slowly, those visits turned into evaluations. I noticed how Douglas would walk through the house, opening cupboards, lifting lids off pots, asking why I hadn't fixed the faucet or why the attic light still flickered. Then came the suggestion that I might be more comfortable in a smaller space, something easier to manage. And I, foolishly wanting to stay close to family, agreed to sign over the deed, at least partially, so they could refinance and help with expenses. That was the phrase, help with expenses. It sounded practical, reasonable, final. Within 6 months, I found myself moved into the annex, a converted tool shed with a bathroom added later, and the main house was no longer mine. Not in any way that mattered. At first, I tried to maintain the illusion that we were still close, still family. I cooked dinner every Sunday, even though they rarely joined me. I left notes asking if the grandkids, Jacob and Elise, wanted to come over and play chess or help me in the garden. Most of the time, there was no response. If I pressed the matter, I was told they were busy, that they had homework or sports or weren't feeling well. Eventually, I stopped asking. I found myself eating dinner alone more often, listening to the echo of silverware in an empty room. Kayla was always blunt in her cruelty. She once told me after I knocked over a glass of water at their kitchen table, "You're lucky we even feed you." I remember those words because they didn't come out in a fit of anger or frustration. They were calm, measured, as if it was a truth I should have already known, that I existed at their mercy and that mercy was conditional. After that, I stopped coming into the main house unless asked. I ate in the annex, bought my own groceries with the small pension I received, and tried not to be noticed. I still walk, most mornings. There's a park about a mile away. I take the long way around the neighborhood to get there. I pass the houses of former students sometimes. One of them, Samantha Jameson, always waves if she's outside. She has 3 boys now, all red-headed and loud, and she never fails to offer me lemonade or ask if I'm keeping warm in winter. But I decline. Not out of pride, but because I don't want to see the pity in her eyes. I've seen enough of that to last me a lifetime. The winters are hardest. The annex isn't well insulated, and some nights I sleep with my coat on. The heater breaks down often, and I can't always afford to fix it right away. Douglas says he'll look into it, but he never does. Kayla leaves bags of food at my door sometimes, leftovers, expired cans from their pantry, fruit that's already soft. She doesn't knock. She doesn't say hello. Just drops the bag and leaves, like feeding a stray animal you don't want to get too attached to. I used to write in my journal daily. Now I write less, but I still try to document what I can, even if it's just the weather or what I saw on my walk. It keeps me grounded, reminds me I still exist. There's a note taped to the wall above my small desk in my wife's handwriting. The measure of a man is not in how he's remembered, but in how he endures the forgetting. I don't know if she meant it to be prophetic, but it feels that way now. What keeps me awake some nights isn't fear of dying alone. That I've made peace with. But the quiet suspicion that, if I were to die tomorrow, Douglas wouldn't tell anyone right away. He might see it as an opportunity to gain something, a way to avoid paperwork or complications. And if that sounds paranoid, it's only because I've had years to observe how his face lights up more at the mention of insurance than it ever did at my birthday. I once believed, perhaps naively, that raising a child meant creating a connection that would outlast you, that some part of you would be cherished long after you were gone. But I now know that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and memories don't always breed gratitude. Sometimes they breed resentment, and sometimes the ones you gave the most to are the first to forget what you gave. I don't want revenge. I'm too old for vengeance. What I want, what I need, is clarity. The truth, unvarnished. I need to understand how love turned into obligation, how presence turned into burden, and how my life, once full of books and students and family dinners, has narrowed into a quiet existence inside a glorified shed behind someone else's home. This isn't a tale of a cruel son and his heartless wife, not entirely. It's about the slow erosion of dignity and the silence that comes with being seen as no longer useful. It's about what happens when care becomes currency and aging is mistaken for incompetence. I tell this story not to be pitied, but to be heard. Because the worst part of all this isn't the loneliness, or the cold, or even the empty fridge. The worst part is knowing they believe they're doing me a favor simply by not throwing me away completely. And yet, there's more to come. I can feel it. Something in the air has shifted. There are whispers behind closed doors. Quiet conversations that end when I enter a room. Something's coming. And for the first time in years, I'm listening. Closely. Because they think I'm weak. They think I'm helpless. But they've forgotten the one lesson I taught every student who ever sat in my classroom. The most dangerous man is the one who has nothing left to lose. It happened on a Tuesday morning, one of those overcast, indecisive days in early spring when the ground is still too stubborn to thaw, and the wind carries with it the last bitterness of February. I was sitting at my small kitchen table in the annex, spreading the last of my peanut butter on a piece of dry toast, when my old flip phone buzzed against the Formica surface. I don't get many messages these days, mostly spam or reminders from the pharmacy, so I assumed it was nothing. But when I flipped it open, I saw a name I recognized. Nathan. My grandson. The older of the two. 17 now, I believe, though I hadn't seen him up close in more than a year. The message had no greeting, no punctuation. Just a line of text that made my hand go cold. Can't believe the old man still lives. They used to say he was lucky we even fed him. It was followed by a laughing emoji, a skull, and then nothing. A message clearly not meant for me. Probably for a friend or a classmate, maybe even a girlfriend. A slip of the thumb. A wrong recipient. But the damage was done in an instant. I stared at the screen for a long time, rereading the sentence. There was no ambiguity. No room for misunderstanding. He was talking about me. The old man. And not just him, they used to say it. Meaning it was a repeated phrase, a family joke, a sentiment passed around the dinner table after I'd gone back to the annex. Perhaps while eating the food I had bought with my own money. I sat frozen for several minutes, my toast forgotten, the phone still in my hand. Something inside me cracked, not loudly, but with that soft internal shattering that comes only from betrayal. And it was betrayal. I had tolerated years of distance, of silence, of being brushed aside like a piece of worn furniture no one wants to throw out just yet. But this was contempt. Open, casual, generational contempt. A joke at my expense sent without hesitation, without remorse. I didn't reply. What could I have said? That I saw it? That I understood? That I forgave him? No, I did nothing. I just closed the phone and placed it back on the table as if it hadn't happened, as if I could will it into fiction. But of course, it sat there between me and the truth I could no longer ignore. They didn't see me as family. Not really. I was a relic, a burdensome obligation, a figure of pity and faint annoyance. The myth of mutual respect I had clung to was gone, dissolved in one errant text. I waited. Maybe Nathan would realize his mistake and send a follow-up. Maybe he'd apologize. But the hours passed in silence. No buzz. No call. No second message. That silence became the loudest part of my day. It told me everything I needed to know. The next time I saw Douglas was 3 days later. He stopped by the annex, unannounced as always, walking in like he owned the place. Which I suppose, in a legal sense, he did. He didn't knock. He never knocked. Just opened the door and stepped in, tracking mud across the faded rug Margaret had chosen 20 years ago. He asked if I had the electric bill from last month, said something about needing it for a tax deduction. I handed it to him without comment. I said nothing about the message. I wanted to see if he'd say anything, if Nathan had confessed. He didn't. He was distracted, pacing, annoyed, muttering about interest rates and insurance premiums. He didn't even ask how I was doing. At one point, he opened my fridge, wrinkled his nose at the empty shelves, and said, "You need to start eating better. Kayla says you're losing weight again." As if it were a criticism. As if I were neglecting myself just to inconvenience them. I watched him as he looked around the annex with thinly veiled disgust. He tapped the thermostat, frowned at the old heater, checked the ceiling for leaks. It wasn't concern. It was evaluation. I knew that look. I'd seen it before, on realtors, on landlords, on men calculating what could be stripped and sold. "I've been thinking," he said finally, still not meeting my eyes. "Maybe we should look into assisted living. One of those nice places in Ames or Des Moines. You'd be more comfortable. Meals provided. Staff around in case something happens." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. He wasn't suggesting it out of kindness. There was no warmth in his tone, no sincerity, just convenience. He wanted me gone. Out of the annex, off the property. I wondered if they were planning renovations. An Airbnb conversion, perhaps. Extra income. "I'm fine where I am," I said calmly. Douglas sighed. The kind of sigh that carries decades of unspoken judgment. "You're getting older, Dad, and we're stretched thin. You don't drive anymore." "The doctor said your blood pressure's not great." "You took me to one appointment," I reminded him, 3 years ago. Since then, I've managed everything myself." He didn't reply, just folded the bill, shoved it in his coat pocket, and left with a mumbled, "Think about it." No goodbye. No handshake. The door closed behind him with a finality that rattled the window panes. That night I lay awake in my narrow bed, listening to the wind scratch against the side of the annex. I thought about the message again. They used to say he was lucky we even fed him. I imagined them saying it around the dinner table. Kayla with her perpetual scowl, Nathan with his sarcastic smirk, Elise quietly laughing along so as not to be left out. Douglas nodding in agreement. Maybe they thought it was funny. Maybe they thought I was too old or too dull to notice. But I noticed. Something changed in me that night. A quiet shift. I had tolerated so much over the years, out of loyalty, out of love, out of fear. But that message stripped away the last veil. I saw them for who they truly were, and I saw myself for what I had become in their eyes. Not a father, not a grandfather, not even a man. Just a mouth to feed, a burden to manage, a problem to solve. And I began to ask myself the question I had been too afraid to confront. What would they do if I were gone? Not dead, just gone, out of the way. How long would it take for them to realize? Would they miss me? Would they even notice? A new thought took root. Maybe it was time I stopped waiting for their kindness. Maybe it was time I stopped hoping they would change. Because if that message was any indication, they never would. And if I didn't act soon, they might decide to act first. They had already spoken of assisted living. What next? Power of attorney, legal guardianship, a signature here, a quiet transfer there, and suddenly, I'd find myself in a sterile room with plastic furniture, my life reduced to medication schedules and supervised meals. I wouldn't let that happen. Not without a fight. Not while I still had a name and a memory and a spine. Not while I still had my own damn mind. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere between me and the family began to shift in a way that was both subtle and unmistakable. It was as though the temperature had dropped a few degrees in every conversation, though the words themselves remained polite, measured, performative. Kayla stopped pretending altogether. She no longer smiled when she passed by the annex. If she left food at the door, she didn't bother bagging it neatly. Sometimes it was just a dented can of soup and a bruised banana placed unceremoniously on the porch table, as if she were feeding a stray that had long outworn its welcome. When I saw her one afternoon as she was unloading groceries, I offered to help carry the heavier bags, a habit I'd never given up even in old age. She didn't even look up. "We've got it," she said curtly. "You should be careful with your back." That would have been considerate if she hadn't said it in the same tone one uses to scold a dog sniffing at the wrong fence post. I made a decision that week, quietly, internally, without announcement or drama. I would no longer offer help around the house or with the yard. For years, I had trimmed hedges, raked leaves, repaired screen doors, reset fuses. Not because I was asked, but because I lived there too, and I believed in dignity through contribution. But now I realized my efforts were unappreciated, even resented. I was no longer seen as someone adding value, just someone using up space and utilities. So I stopped. I stayed in the annex, kept to my routine, made no comments when the trash bins piled up near the curb or when the front gutters sagged with spring debris. I watched from my window as Douglas struggled with a broken sprinkler head I had repaired twice before. He never asked for help. I never offered. There was a silent standoff in those weeks, a quiet battle of endurance. And I think he thought I'd eventually break, apologize, go back to being helpful and invisible. But I didn't. I cooked for myself, did my own shopping, and kept meticulous records of every purchase, every bill, every piece of mail. Not because I was paranoid, but because I had begun to suspect that something larger was in motion. Then came Easter. It was the first family holiday in years where I wasn't invited into the main house. I had always attended, even if only to sit awkwardly at the end of the table, listening to the others talk over me. But this time there was no knock on the door, no offer of a seat. Through my annex window, I saw the cars pull in. Kayla's sister, Nathan's friend, even Elise's boyfriend. A tall, tattooed boy who'd once called me sir in a tone of mockery. The smell of glazed ham and roasted vegetables wafted through the spring air, and the sound of laughter and cutlery and music filled the space between the houses. I waited until dusk. Still nothing. Around 7, I stepped outside to stretch my legs and caught Elise on her way out to the driveway. She looked surprised to see me. "Oh, hi, Grandpa," she said, clutching her phone like a shield. "Happy Easter, Elise," I replied. "Didn't know there was a gathering today?" She blinked, unsure how to respond, and then mumbled something about miscommunication, about how Mom said, maybe you were feeling tired and didn't want to be bothered. I smiled and nodded, letting her off the hook. What else could she say? That they had decided I was no longer part of the family circle? That my presence was an embarrassment? I walked past her and continued down the sidewalk, pretending to enjoy the cool air, though my chest felt like a cracked bell. The next morning, there was a note on my door, written in Kayla's tight, efficient script. "Dad, please don't guilt-trip the kids. We're doing our best. If you're feeling left out, maybe it's time to talk about a more appropriate living situation. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." I read it twice, then burned it in a coffee can out back. The fire hissed quietly, the paper curling like a withered leaf. I made no reply. But that week, I began to notice something far more troubling. I went to refill a prescription at the pharmacy, and the clerk, a polite young woman named Sam, looked concerned. "Mr. Winslow," she said, typing on her keyboard, "I'm afraid your insurance information isn't coming up. It says here your coverage was changed last month." "Changed?" I asked, confused. "By whom?" She frowned. "There's a new primary listed. Someone named Douglas Winslow. We sent confirmation to your email, but maybe it went to spam." It hadn't. I hadn't seen any such notice, and more importantly, I had never authorized any change. I took the printed summary home and stared at it for hours. Douglas had somehow accessed my medical insurance account and changed the point of contact, listed himself as primary. I felt a flush of heat rise up my spine. I still had the right to approve procedures, appointments, prescriptions, but now all billing and administrative correspondence would go to him. It was a quiet, bureaucratic undermining of autonomy. I confronted him 2 days later, trying to stay calm. We stood in the driveway, the sun high and merciless. "I went to pick up my medication," I said. "Apparently, you're now my primary on the insurance records." Douglas didn't flinch. "It's just administrative," he said. "Kayla and I figured it'd be easier if we handled it. You hate dealing with paperwork." "I never asked you to do that," he shrugged. "Well, you didn't object either. It's done. Let's not make a scene." I looked him in the eye and saw no guilt, no apology, just indifference. He believed, truly believed, that he had a right to manage me, to rearrange the details of my life without consultation. I walked away trembling. That night I went through every file, every drawer in the annex. I checked my bank accounts online, changed all my passwords, updated recovery numbers, and removed Douglas as emergency contact. I made copies of everything, statements, deeds, wills, receipts. I wasn't panicking. I was preparing. The next week, my mailbox was full of forwarded mail addressed to Douglas Winslow, CEO Henry Winslow. The implication was subtle but clear. He had registered my address under his name for financial or legal purposes. When I asked the post office, they confirmed that Douglas had submitted a change of address form, partial, not full, just enough to reroute select correspondence. The humiliation was no longer private. It had metastasized. One afternoon, Kayla knocked on the annex door for the first time in weeks. She didn't wait for me to answer. just pushed it open and walked in. She carried a stack of envelopes and papers which she dropped onto the table. "Douglas said you're confused again," she said, looking around like a landlord surveying a unit. "Bills, notices. Maybe it's time we sat down with someone. A professional." "You mean a lawyer?" I asked, though I knew she didn't mean that. "No, Dad. Someone medical. We're just worried." "You're forgetting things." "I'm not forgetting anything," I said calmly. She shook her head. "You're acting paranoid. Locking your doors, hoarding receipts. It's not healthy." "I'm documenting," I replied, "because people around me seem to be rewriting the facts." That silenced her briefly. Then she sighed and turned to go. "Just think about it. We don't want to have to force anything." Force. The word lingered in the air after she left, like smoke that clings to drapes long after the fire's out. That was when I knew. They were building a case, inch by inch, paper by paper. They were positioning themselves as protectors while quietly constructing the argument that I was no longer capable of independent life. And maybe if they said it enough times, if they collected enough anecdotes and statements, someone would believe them. But they had underestimated me. I wasn't drifting into confusion. I was awakening from delusion. And if they wanted a war, they were going to get one. A slow, methodical war, fought not with fists or shouting, but with facts, with records, with signatures, and eventually, with silence. Because nothing frightens manipulators more than a man who stops explaining himself and starts watching. The middle of the story is always where the ground shifts beneath your feet, where certainty starts to fracture, and every decision takes on the weight of consequence. For me, that moment came one bleak morning in late May, when I found myself sitting alone in a sterile hospital room, the bright fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a cruel reminder of my vulnerability. The day before, I had collapsed in my annex, dizzy and weak, the kind of sudden physical failure that makes you realize age isn't just a number, but a relentless force reshaping your existence. The ambulance ride was a blur, a series of antiseptic smells, the hum of machines, voices muffled by masks. My mind, sharp and aware, despite their assumptions, clung to the fragments of clarity like a life raft. When Douglas arrived at the hospital, his expression was unreadable, a mask that didn't reveal whether he was worried or calculating. I refused to let them persuade me to sign any documents right there and then, despite the nurse's coaxing voice and the social worker's gentle suggestions. I knew what those papers would mean. A surrender of control disguised as care. In the days that followed, the family's visits became more frequent but less sincere. Kayla would arrive with lists of appointments and reminders. Douglas talked in clipped phrases about power of attorney and making sure everything was in order, while Nathan hovered awkwardly, unsure how to act around a grandfather he barely knew and evidently didn't respect. They called me Dad, but rarely met my eyes. Elise was the only one who offered a small smile, slipping me a chocolate bar once, but even that felt like a transaction rather than affection. The doctors ran tests, some necessary, some invasive, and the results were cautiously optimistic. My heart and lungs were strong for my age, my cognition intact, though they noted minor memory lapses, the kind anyone might experience. Yet despite this, Douglas began pressing for evaluations from specialists, a neurologist, and a geriatric psychiatrist to build a case. When I challenged this, he said it was for my own protection. The irony was bitter. Protection from what? From living? From myself? The low point came during a consultation where a stern-faced neurologist asked me questions that felt more like an interrogation. Do you often forget where you are? Do you get confused about dates or appointments? Have you misplaced important items recently? I answered honestly but carefully, aware that any hesitation could be twisted into evidence against me. Later, I overheard the doctor telling Douglas, "He's borderline. You should consider guardianship for his safety." I clenched my fists beneath the crisp hospital sheets, a cold fury rising in my chest. Back at the annex after discharge, the house felt colder, emptier. I was no longer just an old man living alone. I was a patient under surveillance, a subject of study. The phone rang more often, mostly with reminders about medications and checkups, but occasionally with curt messages from lawyers and social workers, signaling that the wheels of a quiet legal machine were turning. I found myself reading and rereading the documents they wanted me to sign. Contracts that would hand over not just finances but decisions about my body and mind to Douglas and Kayla. I refused. Instead, I reached out to an old friend, Marvin, my former student, now a lawyer who had shown me kindness when I was at my lowest. He listened without judgment as I recounted the attempts to strip me of my autonomy. He advised me to gather medical opinions from independent doctors, to document everything meticulously, and to prepare for a legal battle that might be long and exhausting. "You've got to show them you're still the man you've always been," he said firmly, "that you still have the strength to stand for yourself." That counsel gave me a flicker of hope amid the storm. I arranged for a thorough medical examination at a clinic unrelated to the hospital where they'd done the initial evaluations. The specialists were kind but professional, asking the same questions in ways that made me feel less like a subject and more like a person. The neurologist smiled gently after the tests and said, "You're sharp, Mr. Winslow. Just a bit tired." The geriatric psychiatrist nodded in agreement, and the final report confirmed my competence. With these documents in hand, I felt a renewed sense of control, though I knew the battle was far from over. Douglas and Kayla wouldn't easily relinquish their plans. They were like two pieces of a machine designed to dismantle the life I had built, step by step, brick by brick. But now, armed with truth and allies, I was ready to fight back. The emotional toll was heavy. I caught myself doubting my own memories, questioning whether I was too proud or too stubborn. But deep down, I knew who I was. The man who had taught generations of students to think critically, to question narratives, to fight for their voice. That same man was here now, fighting not for a classroom, but for his right to live with dignity and respect. Meanwhile, the community began to take notice. A few neighbors, hearing whispers of the family conflict, reached out with offers of help or words of encouragement. The local church pastor visited, bringing a homemade pie and speaking gently about the importance of family and forgiveness, though I wasn't sure which family he meant. Old acquaintances who had drifted away came back with concerned calls and invitations to lunch. For the first time in years, I wasn't completely alone. Yet the house was no longer just a home. It was a battleground. Every letter, every visit, every phone call carried the weight of an impending judgment, not just of courts, but of the fragile bonds of kinship. And I realized in that moment that this was no longer just about surviving the years left to me. It was about reclaiming my story, my name, and my legacy. As I prepared to face the coming storm, I understood something vital. The true test was not in proving I was capable, but in standing firm when those closest to you try to tell you otherwise. The battle truly escalated. The day I discovered my bank account had been accessed without my knowledge. It was a quiet morning, as most had become since the hospital discharge. The light filtered through the small annex window, casting pale bars across my desk as I sat down to pay bills. Water, electricity, the usual thin stack. When I logged into my online banking portal, a sinking feeling gripped my stomach. 2 recent transfers I hadn't authorized, one for $3,000 to a business I didn't recognize, and another pending for $7,500 flagged as family support. Both withdrawals had been requested under the joint access clause I had stupidly signed years ago, when Douglas convinced me that streamlining finances would be simpler if we shared access. I remember his exact words, "Just a technicality, Dad. We'll never touch it without talking to you first." Lies delivered with a smile. Manipulation dressed as logic. I contacted the bank immediately, speaking with a woman named Linda, whose clipped tone softened only after I explained the situation in slow, deliberate detail. She told me the transfers had been approved from a device registered to Douglas, and because of the shared access, technically nothing illegal had occurred. "Unless you can prove coercion or deception," she added delicately, "there's very little we can do retroactively. You could remove him as a co-holder, but only if both parties consent." I thanked her even as I felt a heat of shame rise into my chest, not because I'd lost money, but because I had allowed myself to believe, even for a moment, that blood made people honest. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for nearly an hour, the monitor still glowing faintly. My name was on the account. My money had been moved, and I had no power to undo it. That same evening, Douglas arrived, unannounced. He had a confident stride, almost casual, the way a man walks into a room he believes he owns. He didn't mention the transfers. Instead, he dropped a folder on my kitchen table and gestured for me to open it. Inside were the papers for durable power of attorney, documents granting him full control over my medical and financial decisions should I become incapacitated. The word was bolded in several places, highlighted, echoing. "I don't need these," I said, voice measured. "They're just a precaution," he replied. "It's not about today. It's about tomorrow. What if something happens again? A stroke? A fall? You want us scrambling to get court orders while you're in a coma?" I studied his face, searching for anything that resembled concern. There was none, just the confidence of a man who thought he had the upper hand. "What if I told you I already made legal arrangements?" I asked. He blinked, visibly annoyed. "What kind of arrangements?" "A living will, a legal defense against guardianship claims, revoked all prior joint powers, appointed a different representative." His expression changed then, not to rage, not quite, but to something sharper. Calculation disrupted. He gathered the folder back into his arm and stood there, silent. "You've always been stubborn," he said finally. "Mom used to say that." I didn't respond. I wouldn't let him draw Margaret into this, not now, not as a weapon. He left without saying goodbye. 2 days later, I noticed a strange car parked across from the house. A sleek gray sedan, tinted windows, no visible plates. It lingered each afternoon for a week. On the 4th day, I walked out with a notepad and began writing down its details. It drove off within minutes. Coincidence? Possibly. But paranoia, when justified, becomes strategy. I started to hear whispers in town. At the pharmacy, a clerk asked if I was getting help now, which I found strange. At the post office, a neighbor asked if I needed anything dropped off since Douglas mentioned you weren't getting out much lately. Lies were blooming in the soil of my life like weeds I hadn't noticed. Douglas and Kayla were painting a portrait of a confused, isolated man who couldn't keep up with the world anymore. The narrative was being constructed deliberately and methodically, one sympathetic outsider at a time. At night, I wrote everything down. Every encounter, every suspicious transaction, every comment from strangers that suggested a shift in public perception. This wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore. It was an erasure. They weren't simply sidelining me. They were redefining me in the eyes of others, dismantling my identity to justify their behavior. The annex felt less like a home and more like an observation chamber. I imagined them referring to me as declining, as difficult, perhaps even a risk to himself. It would make it so much easier to seize what remained of my independence. The most painful blow came from Elise. She stopped by one afternoon, rare in itself, and knocked, uncharacteristically gentle. I let her in, served tea, and for a while, we talked pleasantly. She spoke of college applications, of uncertainty, of music she liked. I was beginning to believe she still saw me as her grandfather when she stood to leave and hesitated at the door. "Grandpa," she said, eyes averted, "I heard from Dad that you tried to cancel your insurance. That's dangerous. You could get sick again. Maybe you should let them help. Just until you're better." I asked her gently, "Do you think I'm not well, Elise?" She paused, uncomfortable. "I think maybe you're overwhelmed. That's what Dad says. That you forget things. That sometimes you yell at shadows." Her voice faltered. "He said you left the stove on last month, that there was smoke." There had been no such incident, but the story had already been planted. "Elise," I said quietly, "look at me." She did, and I said as calmly as I could, "If you ever doubt the truth, come ask me first. Don't let other people decide what's real for you." She nodded, but I could see it. The uncertainty, the seed of doubt already rooted in her mind. I was no longer the steady presence who read her poetry and helped her with science projects. I was now a subject of concern, a question mark in her world. After she left, I called Marvin. "We need to accelerate everything," I told him. "They're not just coming for my finances, they're coming for my history." Marvin, ever patient, walked me through the steps. We would file for a formal review of all shared assets, separate remaining entanglements, and prepare a cease and desist regarding character defamation. I even authorized him to draft an affidavit affirming my cognitive health, signed by the independent physicians. We began contacting financial institutions, removing Douglas's name wherever it still lingered like a virus on my accounts. We set up new security layers, reissued cards, and created a paper trail to show my full control. The final straw came on a Sunday morning when I received a notification from the county records office. A lien had been placed on the annex. I had not requested or approved any such action. Upon investigation, it turned out to be an attempt by Douglas to consolidate ownership for estate planning. The phrase made my blood boil. I was still alive, still thinking, still breathing. And they were planning my estate like I was already in the ground. I contacted the office, filed an immediate dispute, and notified Marvin. He launched a formal complaint. I also visited the office in person, wearing my best suit, shaking hands with staff, explaining myself clearly and with unwavering clarity. I told them I was being erased by my own blood, and they listened. That afternoon, I packed a suitcase. I had made arrangements to stay with an old colleague, Leonard, a widower like myself, who offered a spare room in his modest home across town. I left the annex without a word, without a note, just my papers and clothes and memories. I watched the place vanish in the rearview mirror, a space no longer safe, no longer mine. I lived quietly with Leonard for several weeks. During that time, we finalized the legal filings to freeze access to all disputed property, began the process of splitting any co-owned assets, and prepared a case to challenge the misuse of shared authority. I spoke with community members, former students, and even local journalists. I told my story, not as a victim, but as a man reclaiming his voice. The response was overwhelming. One article in the Sunday paper titled "Elder Abuse in Plain Sight" went mildly viral in our county. Strangers offered support. Others shared their own stories. And Douglas, suddenly, became very quiet. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more move to make. And it was going to change everything. It was early evening when I stood outside the front door of the house I had once called mine. Now technically owned in thirds, Douglas, Kayla, and myself. I hadn't set foot on the main porch in over a year. The paint had chipped, the planters Margaret once kept blooming were now dry and cracked, and there was a palpable sense of absence despite the porch light's automatic glow. I hadn't come for nostalgia. I had come to deliver a formal notice of intent to sell the property. The papers were in my coat pocket, sealed in a crisp envelope bearing the lawyer's insignia. I had no illusions about how they would react, but I was done waiting, done accommodating, done letting my family rewrite the story of who I was and what I had earned. Douglas opened the door with a look that blended annoyance and surprise, as if, even now, after all that had passed, he still believed I owed him warning, deference, explanation. He said nothing at first, standing in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame, looking not at me but just past me, like I were something to be avoided, an obligation materializing too early. "We need to talk," I said. My voice was firm, not raised, but laced with a finality he could not mistake. I handed him the envelope, and he hesitated before taking it. "You'll want to read that carefully." He opened it there, right on the porch, scanning the lines with widening eyes. I watched the color drain slightly from his face. "You can't do this," he said, voice clipped. "You can't force us to sell the house." "I can," I replied calmly, "and I have. I own a third. And since the other 2/3 have consistently acted in bad faith, the law permits forced sale proceedings if one party initiates." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "No judge is going to side with you. Not after everything. You're confused, paranoid. I've passed 3 separate cognitive assessments from licensed specialists, independent, filed, and notarized. You can request copies from my attorney." Douglas stared at me, the full weight of the moment beginning to settle on his shoulders. I saw it, the recognition that I was not bluffing, not ranting, not deteriorating. I was lucid, prepared, and more importantly, unafraid. "You're doing this to hurt us," he said finally, "out of spite, after everything we've done for you." "Done for me?" I echoed. "You stole from me, lied about me, tried to dismantle my autonomy piece by piece and paint me as senile to cover your greed. If anyone's been hurt, Douglas, it's me." He stepped back, gripping the envelope tighter. "This isn't over," he muttered. "We can fight this in court." "Then fight," I said. "But be prepared to explain the unauthorized bank transfers, the false medical claims, and the attempt to file a fraudulent lien on a living co-owner's property." He flinched at that, and I turned and left without another word. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation. I had delivered the blow, clean and precise, where it mattered most, not to his pride, but to his plans. In the days that followed, silence settled over their end of the world. I heard nothing directly. But Veronica, my lawyer, received angry letters from their counsel, filled with threats and counterclaims that crumbled quickly under the weight of documented evidence. She kept me updated, and each message she relayed only confirmed what I already knew. They were cornered, humiliated, and desperate. And desperate people often make mistakes. One morning, a week after the formal notice, I returned home from the grocery store to find my mailbox stuffed with printed photographs. Dozens of them. All grainy shots of me leaving buildings, walking through parks, talking to shop clerks. Surveillance. Some had captions scrawled in blue ink. "He looks confused here. Is this man fit to handle legal affairs?" It was pathetic, juvenile, and illegal. I took them straight to the sheriff's office and filed a harassment report. The deputy there, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, looked through the images and asked, "Family?" I nodded. He shook his head slowly. "Shame." The sheriff himself called Douglas later that day. I don't know what was said, but 2 days afterward, Veronica received notice that their attorney had advised them to cease all aggressive action and comply with legal procedures. The forced sale would proceed, and the buyer, bless him, was still interested, though the delay had lowered his offer slightly. I accepted without hesitation. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about closure, but the climax didn't come in a courtroom or a law office. It came at the cafe near my new apartment, where I met them one last time, Douglas, Kayla, and even Elise, who had insisted on coming. I had agreed to the meeting because I knew they needed it, not because I did. I no longer owed them answers, but I wanted to see their faces one more time. I wanted to remember them not as the people I loved, but as the people they chose to become. Douglas was already seated when I arrived, suit rumpled, jaw tight. Kayla looked thinner, tense, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Elise sat quietly beside them, watching me not with anger, but with something closer to hurt. "You've humiliated us," Kayla said before I'd even taken my seat. "No," I replied. "You've humiliated yourselves. I just refuse to cover for it anymore." Douglas leaned forward. "What are you hoping to gain from all this? A few $1,000s? A moral victory? You'll die alone, you know." "I've been alone a long time," I said softly. "The difference is now I choose it." Elise opened her mouth then, trembling. "Grandpa, did you really mean to leave nothing to us?" "Not even me?" That cut deeper than I expected. I looked at her. This young woman who once sat on my lap while I read her stories, who I once carried on my shoulders through the county fair, and I said, "I left everything to people who didn't try to make me feel like I was lucky to be fed." Her lips trembled and she looked away. Douglas pushed back from the table, face flushed. "You're vindictive." "No," I said, "I'm free." I stood, paid for my coffee, and walked out into the evening. The sun was setting, golden light spilling across the pavement, and for the first time in years, I felt unburdened. I had lost a family, yes, but I had found something far rarer, a sense of justice, hard-earned and honest. Let them rage, let them retreat. Let them rebuild whatever house of lies they needed to survive what they'd done. I had no interest in chasing their redemption anymore. I had reclaimed my name, my choices, my silence. And sometimes, that's the only victory worth having. I live in a small apartment now, tucked away on the second floor of an old brick building with creaky stairs and a view of a maple tree that turns gold in the fall. The space is modest, just 2 rooms and a balcony, but it is mine. Everything inside it, from the battered bookshelf to the worn recliner where I read in the evenings, was chosen by me, arranged by me, untouched by the disapproving hands that once insisted they knew what was best for me. There's peace in that, a kind of peace that comes not from luxury or noise or companionship, but from knowing that nothing in your life has been borrowed or stolen or laced with silent contempt. It's quiet here, and I like it that way. My neighbors are kind, not intrusive. There's a widow downstairs who leaves loaves of bread on my doormat, and a young couple next door who helped me set up my new television without treating me like a relic. I go for walks every morning, longer now, unhurried. I pass the park bench where I sometimes sit with a paperback, and occasionally strangers will stop and chat. No one here knows my family. No one calls me burden or liability. I am just Henry, the quiet man who likes poetry and walks with a slight limp. The house has been sold. The papers went through without a final word from Douglas. I assume the money reached him and Kayla. I no longer ask or check. My portion went into a trust, split between two causes: a scholarship fund for public school English teachers and an endowment to the community library, where I once gave lectures in retirement. I left specific instructions that neither donation bear my family name. I didn't want them associated with something they never valued. I also rewrote my will. It was the simplest thing I've done in years. Everything I have, what little there is, will go to 2 former students and a local shelter for displaced seniors. No one shares my blood in those pages. No one who looked at me with cold appraisal or spoke of me in the past tense while I was still breathing. There will be no bitter probate hearings, no false eulogies, just quiet resolutions, and I hope something useful left behind. I haven't heard from Elise in months. I think about her more than I should. Not because I wish to forgive her completely, I'm not sure I can, but because I remember the child she was, the softness, the spark. I remember her laughter when she spilled flour all over my kitchen floor during our first baking lesson, and how she insisted on writing her own thank you notes in elaborate cursive. That girl is still in there somewhere, I believe. But whether she chooses to find her way back to that truth is no longer my concern. As for Douglas and Kayla, I feel nothing now. Not hate, not sorrow, just distance. They will explain my absence however they need to. They will frame the story to suit their conscience or lack thereof. Perhaps they'll say I grew bitter, became unwell, turned against them for no reason. Let them. I no longer live in their version of events. They are free to decorate their guilt with whatever colors they prefer. I have stepped out of the painting entirely. I think often of Margaret. Her voice still visits me in dreams, not as a ghost, but as memory clarified by time. She warned me once, long before the unraveling, that love must be seen to be sustained. She told me quietly that silence between family members is never neutral. It accumulates, calcifies, becomes cruelty in disguise. I wish she'd been wrong. I wish I had listened sooner. Still, I do not feel broken. On the contrary, I feel rebuilt. Slower, perhaps, and a little lonelier, but sturdier, like old wood hardened by weather. There is a dignity in knowing where your line is, in defending it not with rage, but with resolve. They said I was lucky they even fed me. Let them choke on that sentiment. I have fed myself since, and better. In the end, this wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about boundaries, about reclaiming the last chapters of your life from those who would edit you out of your own history. It was about being old and still mattering, not in the eyes of others, but in your own. So now, in these quiet evenings, as I sit with a book or watch the sun slip behind the rooftops, I feel no bitterness, only a steady, earned silence. I was not thrown away, I walked away. And that, I think, is the greatest act of defiance an old man can make.